remember that a few months back we had singing teacher and MDH Breathing Coordination coach Lucinda Allen on the podcast, talking about how to fix our inhale to transform our singing. Well, good news, Lucinda is back, and this time helping us focus on our exhale, setting up that all-important airflow and pressure relationship, exploring the idea of absorption for breath support, and much more. Lucinda Allen, as I promised, I've dragged you back. We spoke about 2 months ago on optimizing the inhale, and now we're back to focus on the exhale. But how have you been in the meantime?
I've been really good, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me back. It's I loved speaking to you before, and yeah, I'm just thrilled to talk about this kind of topic and just share and learn more. So thank you for inviting me back. I've been good, and I love doing these kind of things. So here we go.
Yeah. So first things first then, last time I asked you what are some of the common challenges that you see in singers when it comes to the inhale. But what do you see on the opposite side then? What are the most challenging things that people face when it comes to the exhale for singing?
Yeah, so with the exhale, I mean, we live in a fairly stressful world, don't we, with lots of things happening and lots of things going on around us. And there tends to be, for me, when I'm working with singers, a slightly faster exhale, this kind of sense of wanting to maybe drive the air, whether it be just in breath or when it comes to them voicing, that there tends to be a common theme of seeing and hearing singers driving a little bit more air. So the speed of the air is faster, the volume of the air, we're actually kind of expelling quite a lot of air, which is telling us that we potentially could be taking in quite a lot more air than we need. So this is kind of like imbalance with the big inhale. We then have this a large volume of air to expel. So I tend to see it's quite a big statement, but a lot of the singers I work with really driving and sending more air than is functionally optimal, I think is the best phrase.
Just reflecting then from the inhale conversation last time, you just mentioned there about seeing singers take in probably too much air. So how do we know how much air we actually need for the vocal task?
Yeah, so actually we always have enough air in us to be able to make a sound. I mean, if you were walking along the street and someone walked out in the road, you would likely not go, stop. You would probably just go, oh, let me get rid of all that air. Hang on, there we go, that's better. You'd probably do, stop. You wouldn't even think about the inhale. The air is within us to be able to make those vocal commands. And that's, I think, part of our makeup to be able to sort of survive. It's actually probably a survival mechanism to be able to respond that quickly. So actually, I think we sometimes underestimate how little amount of air it takes for the vocal cords to be able to vibrate and make a sound. And if that coordination of the airflow and the vocal cords is not balanced, then we're not going to necessarily be able to get that lovely chord closure and connection in the cords that we want. We're either going to get the cords blown apart by all of that fast moving air, or they're going to want to contract and squeeze together to try and maintain that function to be able to make sound, but they can't because of that huge flow of air that we don't necessarily need. So yeah, I think actually just reminding that we need way less than we think we realize. And actually a lot of that is also connected to the sort of state that we might feel in psychologically as well. I think when we feel anxious, we feel uncomfortable in a situation, we tend to hold the breath or we tend to increase airflow. So I think we have to be mindful that we're not moving closer to a place of mirroring the fight or flight state, actually, so that we're actually telling our body that we're safe when we're breathing and we're exhaling rather than we're in a place of danger.
In your opinion, what exactly are we trying to achieve when we're breathing and exhaling for singing? You mentioned there about this marriage between the air and the muscle. So what are we actually trying to produce?
Yeah, so when we're exhaling, in the words of MDH Breathing Coordination, we ideally want a slow, steady outflow of air. And we often in a breathing exercise think about the air going this way in and out. But actually, I think, like we were saying in our previous conversation, not just thinking about what the air's doing, in for 2, out for 4, in for 4, out for 6. Actually, what's the body doing in that process of the exhale, the inhale and the exhale in this case? So I would always encourage people to actually listen in. We said about listening before, listening with our hands to what the body is doing when we exhale, and coming back to what we want optimally. So when we exhale and we have the slow, steady outflow of air, ideally we want the slow, steady movement of the body, or the function of the body as well. And as soon as we get a sudden movement or jolt, for example, when we put our hand on our chest and we feel the chest go, we can almost certainly connect that idea of fast movement of body with fast movement of air. And the reason we want that slow, steady outflow of air is because we want the vocal cords to be able to do that lovely connection we talked about a moment ago without being disturbed too much by that volume and speed of air. And of course, we have the body, we have the space that the air travels through, the vocal cords, but we also have that space above the vocal cords, which, if the air is traveling too fast, cannot be used in the most acoustically positive way. So if the air goes really fast, we almost don't have time to allow it to spin in that space, which some people call the filter or the resonators, and it almost explodes out through into the world. And I really love that idea of, once the voice has left your lips, or the air has left your lips, you can basically do nothing with it. You're in the hands of the sound engineer, or the room that you're in. If you're in a beautifully resonant room, then there is acoustic potential in that space. But as a singer, once it's left here, we can't do much with it. But if the air is slow and it's allowed to resonate and move in all these lovely spaces, then we have more choices to be able to optimally boost and resonate the voice. So that's why it's really important we have that slow, steady outflow of air.
In that slow, steady outflow, is there an order that you would be encouraging in the body, i.e., the belly is going to lead the exhale, followed by the ribs, followed by, etc.? Or would you expect that to sort of be happening simultaneously?
Again, I'd go back to putting the student or the client's hands on their own body, or in some cases, I feel that movement. And ideally, yes, we would want this kind of coordinated approach. I think when we see one part of the function of the exhale happening quite dramatically out of balance, like, for example, if we see a really big contraction in the stomach area, in the core area, or if we see a real collapse in the chest, then we can say that perhaps that exhale function is not coordinated as optimally as possible. So yes, I think keeping an eye on that one area doesn't dominate that process. We want ideally a balance to be able to serve that slow, steady outflow of air. But in terms of order, it's actually quite different for each individual, because I would see and listen to where they describe that coming from first, and then go back to that idea of, well, if we are getting a slow, steady outflow of, that's a mouthful, slow, steady outflow of air from the client or the student with the coordination that they've got, then I would use that as a start point, I think, rather than trying to rearrange their process if it's actually serving them with that slow, steady outflow of air.
And let's take a dancer, for example, where we often see that the abdominal wall is kind of sucked in and held, like they're ready to do a good bar class or something. If that belly is not available on the inhale as part of that 360 expansion, what sort of problems could we run into in the exhale where belly is no longer available? So exhale is given over to the remainder in the ribs, the chest, and the back.
Yeah, so in the exhale, there is a sense of different directions of movement, I suppose. So actually, in the case of the dancer, I'd be interested to know where they are already recruiting some. I think you stated that they were perhaps doing a little bit more in their abdomen already. Is that what you were suggesting?
Yeah, if they were held in the core and their belly was sucked inwards.
Yeah, I think then that would then make you think that we perhaps wouldn't have the because we actually do want some kind of gentle contraction as we go through the exhale as well. We do have that kind of all the way around the body as well. And if they're already very contracted at the front, that's going to be making me think that there's that sort of slight lopsided approach. So I think there I would consider getting some release for that particular performer. But it can go the other way as well, can't it? That we have completely no awareness of the release and contraction potential in that area. So with a dancer, with the idea of the front of the body, I think more release. But I do tend to notice when people are very core dominant, whether it be release or contraction or a bit of both, that actually going back to looking a little bit higher up the body, so looking at what the ribs are doing there, can sometimes be helpful.
There is that age-old argument, isn't there? Is it belly in or is it belly out? As you exhale, what would happen if we kind of push the tummy outwards instead of allowing that contraction? What happens in that scenario when actually the belly is encouraged to swell outwards when we're exhaling?
So I think I might speak at it the other way around actually a little bit, in terms of what we're wanting from the ribs and the dome of the diaphragm. And then I think that will help inform that question. So on that exhale, we want the ribs to descend and lengthen. And then the dome of the diaphragm is going to be going up. So we get this kind of like double dome effect. So the ribs going down, diaphragm going up. And it's that sort of double dome glide that we call in MDH Breathing Coordination. And if the front of the body is doing perhaps more pushing and pulling than it needs to, it could interfere with that glide of the ribs descending and the diaphragm going up. So that's why we really want to think about it being a 360 panoramic thing. So I think by doing more with the stomach than you need, you could actually be interfering with that glide, but you could also be adding additional pressure than necessary. I was actually speaking to a singer about this earlier, that sometimes when they think really low, it actually moves them so far away from the area which they deeply connect with, which is this particular area. So that's why I feel like the distribution of movement on the exhale is really important. And I think any one area that's got extra pressure associated with it pressure can only go one way in the body, and that's out, and that's not necessarily going to serve or help us with our slow, steady outflow of air.
The relationship between airflow and pressure is inverse. It's this opposite thing, which can be quite confusing. So more airflow equals less pressure, and less airflow equals more pressure. So when it comes to exhaling with voice compared to without voice, what does that mean in terms of how we're going to start thinking about pressures?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when we exhale without any voice, we don't have that closure with the cords. So we have a clear pathway for the air to travel in. And on that journey, when there is no closure from the cords, we're just letting the air slowly and steadily escape. The ribs are descending, the diaphragm's going up. We get that lovely double dome. And we can, of course, blow more air if we want to, but the main difference when we come to voice, of course, is that the vocal cords close, and then we get these periods of time where the air is, of course, slowly and steady moving out of the lips and into the world. But we have this pressure then that goes back the other way, which is often felt by singers under the vocal cords, that sort of subglottic air pressure, as some people call it. And that's where we start to feel potentially the air pressure the retro air pressure that's going back, sort of like sitting under the cord. So we have a little bit of air going this way, but we have quite a lot more going this way, which we have to manage. And when we sing, the ribs descend, the diaphragm goes up, but we have potential, if the body is flexible, to actually absorb some of that air pressure. And that was really foundational for me when I learned more about the MDH breathing coordination method, because I was, as a singer, getting quite frustrated with feeling tight muscularly, finding things weren't particularly helping me, of knowing how to manage this pressure. So I was going up into these parts of my voice around the sort of belty, high chest area where we were building subglottic air pressure, feeling like it was all going around here and just not really know how to move it away from the chords so that they could dance around and create the resonance that I wanted. And it wasn't until I engaged with this work quite a few years ago now where I realized that, yes, there is an air pressure going back, but we can actually do something with that air pressure. We don't have to just contract. Like, we can actually absorb or expand, as MDH calls it, absorption, which is, and it's probably easier to describe actually with an exercise. So if we go to that area of the body that we went to before, we were putting our hand, weren't we, on our top ribs. So remembering that the top ribs start just below the collarbone, and just putting your fingers one side of your sternum and your thumb the other, and just imagining that you were blowing up a balloon. So that kind of pressure, and we're going to do it on off so you can feel the difference. So when we do that exercise, do you feel anything happening under your hand, a direction of movement? Or you might need to do it again if you're listening to this call now to check. Now I've asked that question, but is there any initial thoughts from you on that direction?
Yeah, it seems to make the chest inflate a bit more. My chest seems to come up, and I feel in my tummy coming in a bit.
So that is what we might call like a sign of some absorption in those top ribs. So those top ribs are responding to the air pressure that's going back when you sing. We're just using this as an example. So those top ribs are flexible enough on you to be able to absorb, yay, win, to be able to absorb the air pressure that is going back. Now, quite often I see singers that are don't have that flexibility there, and what's actually it's manifested in is voice fatigue, voice loss. They've lost parts of their range because potentially, this is the hypothesis for some situations, is that they haven't had the flexibility in their body to absorb the air pressure away from here, because this has gone hard, because of their posture, because of their choices of how they're using their body, and it's become inflexible, so it can't absorb the air pressure. So the air pressure has to go here. And there's a nice sort of way of explaining this, I think. If you think of your ribs like a baseball glove and the ball as your air pressure going back, if your ribs just don't move with the force in motion, which is your breath, the air pressure will likely go towards the ribs and then back very quickly under your vocal cords. So your slow, steady outflow of air is not slow and steady anymore. Whereas if your ribs are like that baseball glove that is moving in the same direction as the force in motion, it can slow down the airflow and slowly release the airflow back up, so that when you sing, it can resonate in this space for longer before you expel it.
And when you're doing that balloon exercise there, would you feel the other parts of the body as well, like we did before, and check that those areas are also as flexible?
Yeah, it's a great observation. If you put the back of your hand behind you, sort of around the center of the back, just checking that you're not arching your back or collapsing. I'm sure you're not, Alexa, but just
I am a Quasimodo at many times.
just for anyone listening, and just do the same thing. So we're going to do the balloon exercise, which is as if you're blowing into a balloon.
I feel like I'm like fanning myself on a hot day.
Are you blowing a bit too much air? I just was then, actually, as I started doing it. But
yeah, it's interesting because I don't feel as much there. I feel a little bit, but it's nowhere near as much as the chest.
Right. So this tells us a lot about each individual person, the support system. This is what I call support, managing air pressure away from vocal cord level, is that wherever you feel movement is where you have access to your support system. So if you're not feeling lots of movement in your thoracic spine, so the middle part of your spine, the likelihood is probably some little habits in your life or day that are inhibiting some movement there and therefore inhibiting the support system. So it's not like your support system's broken, it's just maybe not as optimized as it possibly could be. And just remembering that because we have that lovely connection all the way down the spine with our ribs, we have possibility for movement all the way down. Wherever you have that connection between a rib and the spine is a possibility for movement. So we could actually absorb all the way through the spine and the ribs, and even right up into the little ribs that are in your armpit. I think a lot of people forget that they have ribs up in there, but there's possibility for movement there as well, which is really exciting for some people. I think when they kind of feel like maybe they can't access support, well, it's there. It's just we have to free these parts of the body up for you to be able to fully use them in their function of absorption, which is a very natural function. If you look at a baby when it cries, if you were to put your hands gently on it, you would feel it going when it cries. Its body naturally does that absorption action. It's just unfortunately over time we've got into quite a busy life and lots of different ways of being in our bodies, and also sometimes we're unprogrammed and perhaps maybe not necessarily told exactly what our body needs in that moment, so we start overdoing it in one area and then we undo the natural function of this absorption system. So I found that incredibly helpful when we're thinking about managing air pressure. So it's not are you supporting, it's more where are you supporting.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I guess we could filter that with our SOBT choices as well, because the balloon thing that you just did there was quite similar to what I would experience in a puffy cheek, which is a higher resistance SOBT. Equally, I don't know if this is a silly question or not, but I remember last time we spoke, I was finding that I had less expansion in my back in the inhale. And it just so happens that when we did that exhale exercise, then it was again the back. So do you tend to see that those two pair once you've got less flexibility in your inhale in one place? Could it mean that there's less flexibility there when you're exhaling?
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. So that is commonly what happens. And that's why I really focus on the breathing mechanism first, because if we're feeling inhibited areas for movement, mobility in the breathing function, then there's a high chance that's also not able to move as freely when we breathe in, which is that movement of air pressure. So that's why I always come back to the breath as a start point. Otherwise, we're trying to support onto a body or a mechanism that is not ready for it. It can't quite serve us with managing or holding the air pressure.
You mentioned the word support. So how would you describe it? Is it that absorption for you, or is there other parts to that?
Yeah. So I think if you Google the word support, which I think I've done a few times over the years, I really like the explanation that comes up about a dome with columns around holding this dome up, like these lovely fancy columns all around the outside. And if we're missing columns on one side of the dome, it's going to be lopsided and not as balanced and not held up as equally. So I think, yeah, I do use the word support if that works for the singer. But for me, I don't think we can talk about support without talking about and exploring air pressure. So yeah, it's really about working out what's working for each individual person in their breathing mechanism on their inhale and exhale to be able to inform where is there possibility for air pressure management, and then can we find a way of helping each singer and voice user access on a daily basis, because it can change. If you can sat at a laptop all day, you might lose the possibility of being able to access that absorption in the top ribs as easily. So on a daily basis, do we have tools to be able to refine our optimum absorption or support system?
And how would you do that? Is it again through the touch?
Yeah, so I first do an analysis or exploration with the person together, and I do that through usually my hands-on, if the client or student is happy with that, to actually feel where there's more potential for movement more potential for absorption or support. And then we work out where the areas in the body are not offering quite so much. And we always use positive wording in MDH. So it's not, this bit's broken, it doesn't work. It's more, this area could offer you so much more flexibility, mobility, and absorption potential, because then that helps our brain realise that there's something good to come of it. And then identify exactly where those areas are. And then there's over 100 procedures in the MDH Breathing Coordination method, which sounds quite overwhelming, but I help find the ones that really work for the individual to be able to undo anything that doesn't serve them in terms of the areas of the body that aren't quite working. So that could be through touch, that could be through touch and visualization. It could be through just some breath work, very specific guided breath work. It could be through voicing, and it could then also be bridging the gap of that into their song. So finding particular parts of the absorption system to serve the particular bit that's maybe a bit challenging in the song or the overall song.
You mentioned earlier that we're not looking for something to move in the exhalation like with a big shift to start with. It's all kind of in tandem and moving together. Is that regardless of vocal task? If you're about to come in and belt a note or go up to a really high pitch, are we still wanting to find a gradual descent or contraction? Or is it a case of, for certain things, we will find that things have an onset that is bigger than for something else?
I think we just have to be mindful with, let's, for example, say we were belting or singing a big note. If we do have a sudden abdominal, quite dramatic movement abdominally, it could encourage us to drive a bit more air, which is definitely not what we need when we need to be singing those high belt or more dynamic, powerful notes. So I think that whenever I see a dynamic or dramatic movement, I would always make sure it's not negatively impacting the optimized setup that we're looking for. So yeah, I think in the example of a belting thing, I would just check that the dramatic movement isn't like a domino effect, because everything's touching something else, isn't it, in the body? A muscle connects to a muscle, connects to something else. So I would be really mindful that we don't have a domino effect that could negatively affect what we're trying to make happen in the end. I think there is also a difference between a dynamic energy shift. I think this is actually quite interesting with the belt stuff, the really powerful singing stuff, is that we can think we've got to physically do something really big, but actually quite often if our mind isn't sure why we're making that really big physiological movement, it can be like, why? There's no threat here. Why are you making me make this dramatic movement like I'm in danger? And actually sometimes the dramatic shift or movement could happen psychologically to help stimulate the coordination with the mind and the body. So I don't think necessarily like a dramatic shift or movement, whether that be psychologically or physiologically, is bad. I think it's just we need to make sure it doesn't have a negative effect on the result.
I think it's been really interesting seeing the Wicked movie come out and what Cynthia Erivo said about being on trapeze or flying when she was singing Defying Gravity, and how she had to take her breath into her back more, and that the front of her body was having to remain somewhat engaged because of how she was flying and the way that she had to find those belted notes, and they were possible without having to kind of lock and grip. So how do we know when somebody is using too much muscular or physical effort to support a particularly intense note? What might we see?
So yeah, this is a good way to look at it, I think, is what do we see, what do we hear, what do we or they feel? And I think what we would maybe see is some build-up of air pressure around this area. So around the neck, we might see like a build-up of air pressure, almost like a bit of a fight in there. We might see a sudden dramatic movement in the core. We might see people maybe overlift the chest or even compress the back of the neck. I think actually when we have too much airflow, I nearly always see people's jaws just ping open like a trap door. So we're losing the airflow very quickly. That's one of the most common things I'd see. And then hearing wise, it would manifest through, I think, more of a grip. We might hear some constriction, we might hear some slight distortion or rasp in the voice where the cords are desperately trying to hold the air back from the impetus underneath. It might suddenly go breathy in terms of the tone, or we might hear cracks or breaks in the voice and instability. And then in terms of feel, I think people quite often reach for this area when they feel like what they're doing with their exhale isn't serving that bigger note. So I think we have to consider all of those three things, because sometimes just by listening, we might be like, oh, well, that doesn't sound safe, but they actually might be doing safe distortion. And we might see perhaps what looks like a build-up of air pressure around here, but actually it might be being put in this area in a way where everything is stretching accordingly for that air pressure. So yeah, I think it's definitely bearing all of those things in mind. I'm not sure if I answered the question there. I kind of went a bit off on one, but
no, it's good to know what we can keep our ears and eyes out for. And I think that's quite a common thing, isn't it? We go to belt and we work much harder than we actually need to. And just to reflect what you said at the beginning of our chat here, which was actually we see people taking in maybe more breath than they need to. So if you had a singer in front of you who was just getting locked up, everything was kind of just getting a bit too engaged, how would you help them to reduce that and to find the optimum setup for them and that big note?
Yeah, I think I'd want to be specific. So I'd ask them where they're feeling that additional work or contraction. And just using it as an example, let's imagine that people are going, it's quite a common thing when people sing high in their ranges, they maybe compress the back of their neck and maybe lock down in their shoulder girdle. I would get them to be really precise of where they're noticing that and where they're feeling it. And then I actually end up doing quite a lot of talking in my sessions, because I find like when you clarify the context and the why, people are so much easier to want to flow into that. I think if you just say to someone, just a bit more length in your spine or stand up straight, then it's like, oh no, I'm not being told to stand up straight again, am I? But I think as soon as you explain, well, actually, you're really compressing the back of your windpipe where there is so much space for resonance and stretch, and you could get this amazing boost in your acoustic choice that you're making. So you're kind of shutting off half of your kind of theatre back there. And then it's like, oh, right, okay, so I can see why this would really benefit me. So I end up telling quite a few weird stories. I think people that work with me know that I come up with the weirdest analogies, but as long as it works for the person, that's good for me. And then you were asking about how you would undo extra effort. So it could be done two ways if we're online, or for example, it's a not perhaps shorter session where maybe I've been working with that person a really long time and we've got a very good language and common communication style that works for us. I can quite often use some visualization to get them out of that, and they can use their own touch to undo and think of what we're actually looking for. So if we're looking for some length in the back of the spine and we're looking for a release in the shoulders, we could do an exercise for that. But I think actually connecting a visualization with an exercise is really strong. And I'm not sure if I mentioned it last time, but MDH uses ideokinesis. Mm-hmm. So the idea of movement. So if I get you to think about a waterfall of butter down the back of your cervical spine as you're going towards that high note that you're about to sing, that's going to be much stronger than thinking stand up straight, because then you'll probably hyperextend it and everything will go a bit tight. So using some visualization. And then the other option is actually to use the table work. So that would be getting the client back on the table. I've actually had that a lot this week. Everyone seems to be really locked in their back. So we have a method in MDH where you can gently guide the ribs into a position where they're actually able to absorb better. And just by going back to the table and doing that for a few minutes and then standing again, the client would say, oh, I can actually feel my absorption system now. So that stops them going here. So the age-old thing of stop poking your chin, stop poking your chin. Well, there's a reason we're poking our chin. And my hypothesis is that we're not using our absorption system well enough. So as soon as we get the back moving and we get the air pressure to go into the back, then this stops happening. And then we don't need to keep being told that we're lifting our chin. So it's actually a really lovely cue from the body. Every time that happens to me, I go, thank you. Thanks for reminding me.
Yeah, it's like a maladaptation of, okay, that's not working, so I need to go somewhere else. What does this say about anchoring then, which comes from, I believe, the Estill method? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm really grateful for the Estill model because it was one of the first times where I really felt like I was starting to get the anatomy and what I was feeling and hearing connected. I found that model when I was a young singer, but also, just in a tense state. And I sort of struggled with the idea of support and how we actually engage with that. And I felt really empowered by the Estill model because it gave me really practical tools to be able to think about how the function happens up here. And I was really happy with that. But I still didn't feel a resolve from the idea of, well, what happens to all this muscle tension when I'm singing? And how can I deal with it before and after when I'm singing? So the idea of, and this is just my experience of anchoring, but I think my experience was a sense of muscle work, or at least bringing some effort and energy to muscle. And I think the issue that I found is that it's very difficult to tell which muscles to switch on, because when you switch one on, even if it's nearby one that you want, it will still switch on. And then you've switched on muscles that are already on, because usually muscles that are on will switch on more. So then you end up with a little bit of tension on top of tension that was already there. I found that quite difficult for me. And I also felt like it made me slightly more tense. So I think for me, the idea of like flexibility and movement of muscle, it just aligns better to me. We have a lot of singers with muscle tension dysphonia, and to get them to add more tension to this idea of muscle tension dysphonia, like, just doesn't align for me. So I do find I often get much better results with people thinking about absorption and movement of muscle rather than lots of contraction. Of course, there is some contraction on the exhale. We have lots of muscles that work together to contract, but I think we have to be mindful adding tension to muscles that might already be tight.
Mm. And just to be clear for me, when we're talking about absorption, would we see that as like a inhalated swell type feeling, or would that be a kind of coming down sort of feeling with the exhale?
I think if we explain it through voice, it makes it more useful for us as singers. So should we go back to here again and using the balloon idea, but we're going to add a bit of voice to it. So lots of us are familiar with SOVT methods, but we'll use a block in this case with the lips. So it's as if you're saying b and m at the same time. So could you go smashed it, nice. So when we do that, we're creating that semi-occluded vocal tract, and we've of course got a tiny little bit of air going this way, but we've got quite a lot going back. And instead of it stopping, I've got this silly motorway junction analogy, but instead of it stopping at like junction 1 where we've got a fight going on at the chords, we think about letting it go further down the motorway, and actually almost as if you're directing it under your hand. So instead of we get or wherever you want in your range, but we're absorbing the air pressure into the body rather than locking it here or blowing it out. Should we do a few more together maybe?
Yeah.
We can put your hand behind you as well, just so you can feel your body, not just at the front, but seeing if you can enjoy any movement front and back. So this. I love this idea from Estill, that kind of stretch of the chords, so that kind of whimper or complaining at the same time. So instead of we're thinking so the slow, steady outflow of air is there with that stretch and release of the chords, and then the air being managed here. And it can be quite light, we can have that if we want, but it's actually a little bit more buzzy is more helpful on that. And you might feel it vibrating or spinning around the mouth. So that combination of body, chord, and resonator, I think, is a really good thing to build into the warm-up to balance what we're doing.
Yeah. And it's quite interesting that actually my instinct was to be like more pressurized. So it's a good reminder to say, okay, maybe that's the approach, maybe that's the instinct, but to be reminded that you can still get a good effect with the spinny.
And I think that's the thing. It's like these kind of exercises aren't like necessarily right or wrong, although there's like probably a better way, more helpful way to do it. But it's actually a moment for us to check, because sometimes when we're a bit like, right, I'm doing my warm up, we can, and then we can go, hang on a minute, let me just check in. What am I doing in my body? Oh, okay, I'm not absorbing at all. I've just gone, and actually we can let this absorb. Or, oh gosh, I was blowing loads of air then. So it's like a really good exercise just to check in on those sort of 3 chambers. Can we see what they're doing and what they're telling us on this particular day that we might need to build into our next steps in our warm-up?
Lucinda, you have given us so much insight and so much information on MDH Breathing Coordination and how we can apply it and look out for things in our studios. So thank you so much. A final question that I just have is how this might be able to help somebody with maybe a lung condition, something like asthma, maybe long COVID, COPD, that sort of thing.
I think the idea of the slow, steady outflow is one that would help, and I've experienced this with long COVID singers, is to move the setup away from where it's probably got into a bit of a habit of a lifted rib cage and perhaps that sort of fast, shallow inhale, and actually reminding the body that it is designed, the ribs are designed to lengthen. So going back to following the full path of the exhale is one that I would definitely work with those kind of clients. In fact, Robin de Haas's book, which is all around MDH breathing coordination, is called Path of the Voice. And I think reminding people with those kind of conditions that there is a full path that we might have just forgotten. We've been down it before, but we've just been going up and down the first couple of steps when we perhaps get into that short, shallow breath pattern. And then actually we can remind the body of the full path that it can take, the descent of the ribs and the glide of the diaphragm. And I think that's been extremely positive for helping people remember what is possible, what they were doing before, that it's not something that's new. It was embedded there, and we just need to remind the body of that safely. And a lot of that is also down to the mindset and the approach that we have in terms of the mindset of making sure we're telling the mind that we are safe with our breath. We're not telling the mind that we are in a place of danger. So there's quite a lot of balancing that sort of psychological, but also physiological connection to the breath. And there's lots of research to show, particularly with the MDH work, working with patients with emphysema, that you can extend the exhale with the right guided body work. So it's not just in for 2 out 4, in 4 out 6, it's how can we actually guide the relationship between the inhale and the exhale with the movement of the body and how it's designed to go through that full path.
And is most of what we've chatted, can we find that in Robin's book that you just mentioned there? Is the stuff on absorption and things covered in that book too?
Yes, so there's lots of information on that. Take your time. It's quite a full-on read, but it is, a really inspiring book. I've had lots of positive feedback from my clients that I do encourage to read it. But I also think that a lot of this breath work is best experienced in person. So if you try and embody as much of this as possible in your own way, then I would always encourage that as the most memorable path.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Lucinda. Can you remind us where listeners can find out more about you and get in touch?
Certainly. I'm voiceunlocked.com on the old World Wide Web, and I am at Voice Unlocked on Instagram if you want to follow me there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lucinda. You're a legend for coming back, and thank you so much for your company once again.
Pleasure. Thanks so much.